Picture this: a king of England, once the lord of vast lands, brother to the legendary Richard the Lionheart, son of Henry II, master of Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine. A man who should have ruled with strength, dignity, and the weight of destiny. And yet, in October of 1216, his end came not on a battlefield, not in glory, but in filth and agony inside the damp, crumbling walls of Newark Castle. He lay writhing on a sweat-soaked pallet, consumed by a brutal illness the chroniclers called the bloody flux. Dysentery tore through his body, leaving him broken, humiliated, and alone. There was no loyal court at his bedside, no hymns of praise for a dying sovereign. Only the stench of disease and the whispers of those who believed his torment was divine justice. This was no ordinary man. This was John Lackland, the most reviled king in England's history. The villain of Robin Hood's legend. The monarch who lost everything, his empire in France, the loyalty of his barons, the trust of the church, the very crown jewels of England swallowed by the sea. For centuries, no English king would ever dare name a son John again. And yet, from his cruelty and failures, something extraordinary emerged. Forced by rebellion, John sealed a charter meant to restrain him. What he despised most became the foundation of freedom itself, Magna Carta. This is not just the story of a tyrant's fall. It is the story of how the worst of kings left behind one of history's greatest legacies. October of 1216. The wind cut across the flat, damp landscape of Nottinghamshire, carrying with it the chill of oncoming winter. Newark Castle, an old Norman fortress perched beside the River Trent, stood as both sanctuary and tomb. Its stone walls were thick and cold, soaked with the dampness of centuries. Inside one of its chambers, lit only by weak, sputtering torches, a king lay dying. But not with dignity. Not with glory. Instead, he died in a way that even his enemies would later describe as fitting, humiliating, grotesque, and utterly alone. The man writhing on the rough wooden pallet was King John of England, son of Henry II, younger brother of the legendary Richard the Lionheart, ruler of a kingdom that stretched once across France and the British Isles. To the world, he carried grand titles: King of England, Lord of Ireland, Duke of Normandy and Aquitaine, Count of Anjou. But those titles meant nothing in that dark chamber. They could not ease his convulsions, they could not silence his groans, and they could not disguise the truth: the most hated king in English history was being consumed from the inside out. John's body was a battlefield, though not of swords and shields. Dysentery, the bloody flux, as it was known, had torn through his intestines like wildfire. His fever left him delirious, his muscles spasmed uncontrollably, and every breath was heavy with the stench of infection. Medieval chroniclers, who despised him, did not hold back their descriptions. They wrote that his insides seemed to burst outward, that he left a trail of filth and misery in his final journey. And while many kings before him had died on the field of battle or surrounded by loyal courtiers, John's last hours were the opposite: pathetic, pitiful, drenched in sweat and dishonor. It was an ending that seemed to reflect his reign itself. For nearly 2 decades, John had alienated everyone: his barons, the church, even his own family. He was a man consumed by paranoia and greed, a ruler who demanded loyalty but gave none in return. And now, as he slipped toward death, he was surrounded not by allies, but by ghosts. The ghost of his nephew Arthur, who had vanished mysteriously in John's custody. The ghost of countless barons whose children he had taken as hostages. The ghost of a kingdom drained dry by his endless taxes. His attendants could mop his brow, but they could not erase the weight of judgment that hung over him. For his subjects, this was divine retribution. To the common people who had suffered under his cruelty, the king's torment was proof that God himself had turned against him. To the chroniclers, who inked the story of his reign, it was poetic justice. Here was a man who had bled his people, defied the Pope, and betrayed his oaths, reduced to little more than a broken husk, gasping for air as his body failed. But perhaps the cruelest irony of all was this: John had spent his entire life clawing for power, wealth, and recognition, only to lose it all. Just weeks before his collapse, he had watched the sea swallow his treasure. His baggage train, laden with gold, jewels, and the crown jewels of England, had sunk into the treacherous sands of the Wash, lost forever to the tides. That disaster had stripped him of the physical symbols of kingship. Now, as disease stripped him of strength, it seemed the universe itself conspired to tear away every last vestige of majesty. Newark Castle became his final prison. Fevered and weak, John tried to dictate his will. He named his 9-year-old son Henry as heir, perhaps in a desperate attempt to salvage his dynasty. He confessed sins, asked for forgiveness, and likely wondered if his soul would find any mercy. Yet even these acts seemed hollow. His reputation was too poisoned, his betrayals too numerous. He had united his barons, his clergy, and even the peasants against him, and for once, they stood together in their hatred. On the night of October 18, 1216, John Lackland breathed his last. His attendants recorded little ceremony, no triumphant speeches, no mournful songs. Only a king reduced to agony, slipping away quietly. The chroniclers relished the moment. They painted his death as grotesque, describing him as if his body burst with the poison he had carried within. Literal or metaphorical, it fit the man, a king so full of greed and cruelty that in the end, it destroyed him from within. Yet, as miserable as his death was, it marked the beginning of something far greater than the man himself. John's reign had been a parade of humiliations, but it also birthed one of the most enduring legacies in world history. His tyranny had forced his barons to rebel. Their rebellion had forced him to sign a document he despised. And that document, Magna Carta, would outlive John, outlive his dynasty, and echo across centuries. But none of that was visible in his final hours. In that damp castle chamber, there was only the spectacle of decay. The man who once held the fate of millions was now powerless even over his own body. He had fought to bend everyone to his will, but death bent him easily. For his enemies, it was a moment to savor. For history, it was the closing of a chapter, a cautionary tale written not in victory, but in failure. In the centuries that followed, no English monarch would name their son John. His name itself became a stain, synonymous with betrayal and weakness. Songs and legends turned him into the cowardly villain who opposed Robin Hood, the perfect symbol of corruption and greed. And yet, history also remembered something else. It remembered that in his defeat, in his cruelty, in his endless failures, John had unintentionally given birth to the idea that no ruler was above the law. That is the paradox of King John. His life was a cautionary tale. His death was a spectacle of disgrace. But from that wreckage came a principle that changed the world. Long before John Lackland became the most hated king in England, he was the forgotten son. The youngest of Henry II's 4 boys, he entered the world in 1166 already at a disadvantage. His elder brothers, Henry the young king, Geoffrey, and Richard, were destined to inherit vast lands, titles, and the glory of the Plantagenet dynasty. John, by contrast, had nothing. His father, with a touch of cruel humor, gave him the nickname Jean Sans Terre, John Lackland. That name would cling to him like a curse, shaping both his character and his fate. In a royal household defined by rivalry, John quickly learned that survival meant ambition. His brothers fought wars, forged alliances, and ruled territories. John, excluded from inheritance, watched with envy. He wanted more than scraps, more than to be a pawn in his family's power struggles. From the start, his hunger for power exceeded his means. Henry II, perhaps sensing his son's resentment, tried to carve out a future for John. At one point, he arranged for John to marry a wealthy heiress, which might have given him land and influence. But the union collapsed. Later, Henry sought to grant John a slice of his French territories, stirring fury among his elder sons. The family feuded endlessly, each brother clashing not only with one another but also with their father. For John, these quarrels offered an early education in treachery. He witnessed firsthand how oaths could be broken, how alliances could shift overnight, and how blood ties meant little compared to power. While his brothers gained reputations as warriors, John did not. Richard earned the title Lionheart on crusade. Geoffrey schemed with equal parts charm and ruthlessness. Even the ill-fated Henry the young king carried himself with princely splendor. John, on the other hand, lacked charisma. His strengths, if they could be called that, lay not in battlefield courage but in manipulation. He watched, he whispered, and he plotted. When Richard departed for the Third Crusade in 1189, John finally saw his chance. England, left in the hands of regents, was vulnerable. John began to sow rumors that Richard had died in the Holy Land. He courted powerful nobles, dangled promises, and tried to build support for his own claim to the throne. The scheme was audacious. To undermine his absent brother, celebrated across Christendom as a crusading hero, was an act that shocked even the hardened lords of England. But John went further. When word reached Europe that Richard had been captured and held for ransom on his return journey, John conspired with Richard's enemies to keep him imprisoned. The King of France, Philip II, encouraged John's betrayal, whispering that perhaps the crown of England could be his if Richard never returned. John agreed. He positioned himself as heir, trying to seize castles, wealth, and the loyalty of barons who might prefer a present ruler to one chained in a foreign dungeon. It was a gamble, and one that revealed both John's ambition and his lack of foresight. Richard was eventually released after a colossal ransom drained England's coffers. When he returned, he found his brother's treachery laid bare. Chroniclers recorded Richard's fury, though in an act of extraordinary clemency, he forgave John. Perhaps Richard saw John as too weak, too insignificant to truly threaten him. Perhaps he believed family loyalty should be preserved, even in the face of betrayal. Whatever the reason, John was spared. Yet his reputation was scarred. Even before he wore the crown, England's lords had seen him for what he was, a man willing to betray kin and kingdom for personal gain. For years, John bided his time in the shadows, waiting for another chance. That chance came in 1199, when Richard was struck by a crossbow bolt during a minor siege in France. The wound festered. The Lionheart, legendary warrior and king, succumbed to infection. With his death, John's long wait ended. At last, the overlooked younger son became King of England. The boy who had been mocked as Lackland now possessed everything he had ever desired: the crown, the authority, and the chance to prove himself greater than the brothers who had overshadowed him. For the first time, he was not the pawn but the ruler. And yet, almost immediately, the flaws that had defined his character began to consume him. He lacked the military genius of Richard, the charisma of his brothers, or the political acumen of his father. He ruled not through respect but through fear and manipulation. His barons distrusted him, the church clashed with him, and his people groaned under his demands. Even his marriage revealed his recklessness. John wed Isabella of Angoulême, a girl no older than 12, whose beauty and family connections he coveted. But in taking her, John enraged Hugh de Lusignan, her powerful former fiancé, sparking a feud that helped ignite conflict with the French crown. His inability to balance desire with diplomacy foreshadowed the disasters to come. The irony of John's story is that the crown did not transform him, it merely magnified his weaknesses. Where other kings gained strength from the throne, John found only insecurity. Where others sought loyalty, John bred resentment. The landless prince had finally become king, but the same hunger that drove him from childhood would soon devour him. For a brief moment, however, he stood triumphant. The kingdom was his, the Plantagenet dynasty continued, and John, once the forgotten son, now bore the weight of a realm. But in the shadows of his coronation lurked the truth: this was a man defined not by what he built, but by what he would lose. And he would lose everything. The year 1199 should have been the making of John. With the death of Richard the Lionheart, the youngest son of Henry II finally had everything he had once schemed and clawed for: the throne of England, the wealth of a kingdom, and the authority of a king who could command armies. But where some men rise to the weight of a crown, John stumbled almost immediately. What followed was a series of humiliations so severe that by the end of his reign, he would be remembered not as a monarch of greatness, but as the king who lost everything. John's first great challenge was France. The Plantagenet dynasty had long ruled vast lands across the Channel, Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and Aquitaine. These French possessions, known as the Angevin Empire, made the kings of England some of the most powerful men in Europe. But holding on to them required military skill and political finesse, qualities that John sorely lacked. Almost from the start, John faced a formidable opponent in King Philip II of France, also called Philip Augustus. Philip was shrewd, calculating, and far more capable than John in both diplomacy and war. He saw in John's weaknesses an opportunity to reclaim territories that France had long coveted. Where Richard had been Philip's rival and equal, John was his prey. The first cracks in John's rule appeared with his reckless marriage. In 1200, John wed Isabella of Angoulême, a girl barely 12 years old, whose family connections made her a desirable bride. But in taking her, John enraged Hugh de Lusignan, her former fiancé and a powerful baron. Rather than negotiate or soothe the insult, John dismissed Hugh's anger, treating it as beneath him. The slight spiraled into a full-blown feud, and when Hugh appealed to Philip for justice, the French king seized the opportunity. He summoned John to his court as a vassal. When John refused to appear, Philip declared his lands forfeit. War followed, and John's failures became evident. Unlike Richard, who had inspired men on the battlefield, John was indecisive, paranoid, and prone to retreat. His soldiers did not trust him. His commanders lacked confidence in his leadership. Chroniclers recorded that where Richard had charged headlong into battle, John lingered at the rear, calculating his own safety. The contrast earned him a cruel nickname, Soft Sword. By 1204, the disaster was complete. Normandy, the heart of England's possessions in France and the land where William the Conqueror had risen to power, was lost. Along with it went Anjou, Maine, and Poitou. Centuries of royal heritage slipped through John's fingers. What his father had built and his brother had defended with courage, John squandered within a few short years. The humiliation was immense. The loss of Normandy not only weakened England's influence in Europe but also struck at the very identity of the Plantagenet dynasty. The once great Angevin Empire was gone, reduced to a fragment of its former self. And John, the king who had promised strength, was mocked across the continent as a failure. But losing lands was only the beginning of John's catastrophe. To finance his futile attempts to reclaim Normandy, he turned savagely on his own kingdom. The taxes he imposed were crushing. He levied scutage, a fee knights paid instead of providing military service, not once or twice, but 11 times in just 17 years. It was more than the total collected by his 3 predecessors combined. He taxed trade, inheritance, property, and income. No corner of the economy escaped his reach. Villagers grumbled as their coin was stripped away, merchants cursed his demands, nobles, who once saw taxation as an occasional necessity, now faced an endless stream of levies. John's greed seemed insatiable. Yet it was not only his greed that angered his subjects, it was his cruelty. When barons resisted his demands, John retaliated with vindictive ferocity. He fined them enormous sums for fabricated offenses, seized their estates without trial, and in the most chilling cases, took their children as hostages to guarantee obedience. To defy the king was to risk ruin, imprisonment, or worse. The most infamous example came with the case of Matilda de Braos, the wife of a baron who dared to speak too openly. She accused John of murdering his nephew Arthur of Brittany, a boy who had once been a rival claimant to the throne and who had mysteriously disappeared while in John's custody. The rumor was widely believed, and Matilda's words spread quickly. John's revenge was swift. He captured Matilda and her eldest son, locking them in a dungeon at Windsor Castle. They were given only a meager ration, some oats and raw bacon. 11 days later, the guards opened the cell. Both mother and child were dead, starved to death. One chronicler recorded with horror that in her final madness, Matilda had gnawed the flesh of her dead son's cheeks. This was the message John sent to his kingdom: opposition would be met with cruelty beyond imagination. Fear replaced loyalty, and hatred replaced respect. Even his supporters began to question whether serving such a king was worth the price. By the first decade of the 13th century, John had accomplished what few rulers ever could: he had united nearly every class of his realm against him. Nobles despised him for his greed. The church condemned him for his arrogance. Commoners cursed him for bleeding them dry. And foreign kings laughed at his incompetence. The catastrophe of John's reign was not simply military defeat or financial ruin. It was the corrosion of kingship itself. A king was meant to be a protector, a symbol of stability. John became the opposite, a predator who devoured his own people in pursuit of power he could never hold. And yet, John himself never saw it that way. In his mind, he was king by divine right. His power was unquestionable. His actions, no matter how brutal, were justified by his crown. But the cracks in his rule were widening, and soon they would burst open in a rebellion that would shake the very foundations of England. For now, however, John remained seated on the throne, a king who had lost Normandy, lost the respect of his nobles, and lost the legacy of his ancestors. He sat crowned, but diminished. And in his heart, perhaps he already sensed what history would remember: that he was not the builder of empires but the destroyer of one. By the second decade of the 13th century, John's crown weighed heavier than ever. Having lost Normandy and vast stretches of French land, he turned his gaze inward, not to heal the wounds of his kingdom, but to strip it for parts. Where a wise ruler might have sought reconciliation, John chose domination. His hunger for wealth and power grew even sharper, and the methods he used to enforce it pushed his barons and subjects past the breaking point. Taxes had already bled the realm dry, but John did not stop. Every estate, every trade, every inheritance became a target. He invented new fines, often for imagined crimes, and demanded outrageous sums. Nobles who hesitated saw their land seized without trial. Merchants who resisted found their ships impounded. The crown became less a symbol of justice than a machine for extortion. But what truly set John apart from other kings was not only his greed, it was the cruelty with which he exercised it. He did not simply punish disobedience, he delighted in humiliation. And nowhere is that clearer than in the chilling story of Matilda de Braos. Matilda was the wife of William de Braos, a powerful baron. Her family had once supported John, but tensions rose when the king demanded William's sons as hostages. This was not uncommon in the medieval world, but the way John wielded it was brutal. Hostages were not treated gently, they were bargaining chips. When William hesitated, Matilda made a fatal mistake: she spoke openly of what many already whispered, that John himself had murdered his young nephew Arthur of Brittany. Arthur had been a rival claimant to the throne, captured by John's forces years earlier. His sudden disappearance while under John's custody had sparked endless rumors. Some claimed John stabbed him in a drunken rage. Others said he had him drowned in the Seine. The truth remains uncertain, but Matilda's accusation cut too close. It threatened to expose John as a kinslayer. The king's vengeance was swift. Matilda and her eldest son were seized and locked in a dungeon at Windsor Castle. Their jailers gave them a single ration, a meager bundle of oats and a strip of raw bacon. 11 days later, the cell door opened to reveal horror. Both mother and child were dead, starved in the darkness. Chroniclers whispered that in her final madness, Matilda had gnawed at her son's face. The tale spread quickly, a grotesque warning of what defiance would bring. But rather than cow his barons into submission, it deepened their hatred. John had crossed a line. Even in an age of brutal kings and bloody wars, his cruelty stood out as excessive, sadistic. He was no longer feared as a strong ruler, he was despised as a tyrant. And then, as if his war against his nobles were not enough, John picked a fight with God. The crisis began with the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury, the highest churchman in England. When the monks elected Stephen Langton, a learned scholar favored by Pope Innocent III, John refused to accept him. He wanted his own candidate, a pliant bishop who would bend to royal authority. The dispute escalated into open defiance. John seized church lands, confiscated revenues, and dared the Pope to challenge him. The Pope's response was devastating. In 1208, Innocent III placed England under an interdict. Overnight, the spiritual life of the nation collapsed. Churches closed their doors. Bells fell silent. No Mass was celebrated. No marriages were sanctified. No confessions were heard. And, perhaps most terrifying of all, the dead could not be buried in consecrated ground. For 6 long years, England existed in a state of spiritual exile. To a deeply religious medieval society, this was catastrophic. People feared for their souls. Entire communities lived with the dread that dying under interdict meant eternal damnation. Baptisms were delayed, funerals performed in secrecy. John, meanwhile, carried on as though nothing had changed, enriching himself by seizing the church's revenues. To many, he was not only a cruel king but a man cut off from God. Then, in 1209, Innocent III struck again. John himself was excommunicated. In the eyes of Christendom, the King of England was no longer a Christian sovereign but a damned soul. His rule was illegitimate. He was, quite literally, outside the protection of the Church. The excommunication emboldened his enemies. Barons who had tolerated his rule began plotting rebellion. The French king, Philip II, entertained the possibility of a papal-backed invasion. England teetered on the edge of collapse. Yet John, ever arrogant, seemed blind to the danger. He continued to tax, to extort, to demand obedience as though nothing had changed. By 1213, the pressure became unbearable. Fearing that Philip might invade under the Pope's blessing, John capitulated in dramatic fashion. He surrendered his kingdom to the papacy, declaring himself a vassal of Rome. In exchange, the interdict was lifted and his excommunication reversed. England was once again in God's grace, but the cost was humiliation. The King of England had bent the knee to the Pope, turning his realm into a papal fief. For John's barons, this was the final insult. Their king was not only cruel and greedy, he was weak. He had lost Normandy, bled his people with endless taxes, and now handed their kingdom to a foreign power for protection. His legitimacy was in tatters. By 1215, the resentment exploded into open revolt. A coalition of barons, bishops, and knights turned against him. They renounced their oaths of loyalty and marched on London. John found himself abandoned by nearly everyone except a handful of die-hard loyalists. For the first time, the king who had terrorized his kingdom discovered that his cruelty had united his enemies more powerfully than any friendship ever could. The stage was set for one of the most famous confrontations in English history. At a meadow beside the River Thames, in a place called Runnymede, the barons would present John with a document unlike any before. A charter of liberties, a list of grievances, a weapon forged not of steel but of words. Its name would echo across the centuries, Magna Carta. But that moment was still to come. For now, John was the king who had lost France, fought God, starved his enemies, and taxed his people into despair. His tyranny had made rebellion inevitable. His arrogance ensured that compromise would be fleeting. And his cruelty guaranteed that when the reckoning came, it would not be gentle. By the spring of 1215, John had managed the impossible. In less than 2 decades, he had alienated nearly every corner of his realm. The nobles despised him for his cruelty, the clergy resented his endless quarrels with Rome, and commoners groaned under the weight of his taxes. England had not been united under his rule, but it was now united against him. The barons, men who had once sworn loyalty to their king, began gathering in open defiance. Their numbers swelled with every estate John had extorted, with every family he had wronged, with every injustice that had piled one upon another. Soon they were no longer whispering in shadows but raising banners of rebellion. In May of that year, the rebel barons marched on London. The city's gates swung open in welcome. The capital, the beating heart of England, had abandoned its king. For John, it was a humiliation he could not ignore. Nearly alone, stripped of allies, he realized he could not win a war against half his kingdom. For once, the tyrant was cornered. The barons did not march for the sheer thrill of rebellion. They had demands. Their grievances were long and bitter, but what they wanted most was restraint. They sought to chain the crown itself, to force the king to acknowledge that even his authority had limits. Their vision was not democracy, not yet, but it was something radical, the principle that no ruler should stand above the law. Negotiations began in June at a meadow beside the River Thames called Runnymede. The setting was deceptively peaceful, rolling green fields, the quiet flow of the river, summer air heavy with the hum of insects. Yet beneath the calm, history trembled. Here, in this ordinary meadow, the barons confronted their king. They presented him with a document, carefully drafted, a charter of liberties that would later be known as Magna Carta, the Great Charter. The demands were sweeping. 63 clauses laid out limits on royal power and protections for the realm's free men. Among them, no free man could be imprisoned, exiled, or stripped of property without the judgment of his peers or the law of the land. The king could not levy new taxes without the consent of his barons. Weights and measures would be standardized, ensuring fairness in trade. The church would remain free from royal interference. In essence, the barons sought to put an end to arbitrary rule, to transform the king from a tyrant into a monarch bound by law. John seethed with rage. To him, the very idea was an insult. He believed himself king by divine right. How could mere barons dictate terms to their sovereign? But the reality of his situation was undeniable. His army was fractured, his treasury nearly empty, his throne trembling beneath him. He had no choice. On June 15, 1215, John placed his royal seal upon the charter. Chroniclers described him as furious, his face twisted with anger, his hand reluctant. Yet the deed was done. Magna Carta was born. The barons rejoiced. To them, it was victory. They had forced the king into submission. They believed they had caged the tyrant with words, wrapped chains of parchment around his crown. England, they thought, had entered a new age of liberty. But they had underestimated John. To him, the charter was no sacred covenant. It was a humiliation, a document signed under duress, meaningless in his eyes. Oaths made under threat, he believed, were void. He might have pressed his seal into the wax, but in his heart, he had already plotted betrayal. Only weeks after the ink dried, John sought an escape. He turned to an unlikely ally, the very pope he had once defied. His earlier surrender of England to papal overlordship now paid dividends. As a vassal of the pope, John appealed to Innocent III, begging him to annul the charter. The pope, eager to defend his authority and reward his royal vassal, agreed. He declared Magna Carta null, void, and of no validity forever. With a single papal bull, the Great Charter was stripped of legal force. For the barons, this was the ultimate betrayal. Their triumph dissolved overnight. The king had broken his word, mocked their demands, and enlisted a foreign power to crush their liberties. The response was swift. War erupted, the First Barons' War. Rebellion spread like wildfire. Castles were seized, strongholds besieged, the kingdom torn apart by conflict. In desperation, the barons did something unthinkable. They invited a foreign prince, Louis of France, to claim the English crown. In May 1216, Louis landed in England with an army, marching into London where he was welcomed as a savior. For John, the humiliation deepened. Not only had he lost Normandy to the French, but now his own barons had offered his crown to the son of his greatest enemy. He was a fugitive in his own realm, a king without loyalty, without allies, without hope. The dream of Magna Carta might have seemed broken in those days, a failed peace torn apart by treachery and war. But even in its fragility, the charter carried an idea too powerful to be erased. For the first time, it had been written that the king himself was not above the law. And though John may have scorned it, though the Pope may have annulled it, and though rebellion plunged England into chaos, Magna Carta would endure. Its spirit was alive, carried in the hearts of men who had forced a tyrant to bow, even if only for a moment. In the meadow at Runnymede, something extraordinary had begun. A seed was planted, one that would grow through centuries of struggle, rebellion, and reform. But for John, there was no such comfort. He had bought himself only a brief reprieve, and his betrayals would soon lead him to his final humiliations, loss, exile, and a death as wretched as his reign. When John annulled Magna Carta with papal support, he might have believed he had triumphed. The seal he had pressed at Runnymede, to him, was nothing more than a meaningless gesture wrung from a king under duress. But in breaking his oath, he shattered whatever trust remained. His barons, already restless, saw the annulment as the ultimate betrayal. There could be no compromise now. Only war. Thus began the First Barons' War. England, already strained by years of taxation and tyranny, descended into chaos. Castles became flashpoints, each a fortress of rebellion or loyalty. Roads were cut by marching troops, villages burned, and the kingdom fractured into armed camps. John, once the predator, now found himself hunted in his own realm. The rebels took an extraordinary step. They invited Prince Louis of France, son of King Philip II, to claim the English crown. It was an act that spoke volumes about their hatred for John. They would rather see a foreign prince sit on the throne than endure their own king a day longer. In May 1216, Louis landed in Kent with a French army. The invasion that John had long feared was now reality. To John's horror, London welcomed Louis with open arms. The capital city, the center of royal authority, embraced the French prince as a savior. Soon Louis was declared King of England, in all but name. For John, the humiliation was unbearable. Normandy had been lost years earlier to France, now England itself seemed ready to slip away. The Plantagenet dynasty, built by his father and glorified by his brother, was collapsing in his hands. And yet, John did not surrender. He raced across the kingdom, a fugitive king clinging to fragments of power. His movements were frantic, north 1 week, south the next, always fleeing, always scrambling to hold together the tattered remnants of loyalty. Chroniclers described a man consumed by paranoia, suspicious of every ally, haunted by every shadow. He slept poorly, ate recklessly, and carried his treasure wherever he went, as though gold could buy him the devotion he had squandered. That treasure, however, would become the symbol of his downfall. In October 1216, John attempted to move his forces north through East Anglia. To save time, he chose a dangerous shortcut across a tidal estuary known as the Washington. The place was infamous, its sands shifted unpredictably, and the tides came fast and without mercy. The crossing could only be made safely at low tide, and even then it was risky. John, with his army, crossed first. Somehow he made it to the other side. But behind him came the baggage train, slow, heavy, and laden with treasure. These were not ordinary wagons. They carried the fruits of years of extortion, gold coins, jewels, silver plate, royal archives, and above all, the sacred crown jewels of England, including the legendary crown of Alfred the Great. As the wagons creaked across the muddy flats, disaster struck. The tide turned. Water surged suddenly and violently, sweeping over the sand. Horses panicked and drowned. Guards were dragged under. Carts tipped and vanished into the sucking mire. Within minutes, the entire baggage train, everything John had hoarded and clung to, was swallowed by the sea. It was more than material loss. It was a perfect metaphor for John's reign. All that he had clawed, stolen, and brutalized his people to obtain vanished in an instant, beyond recovery. To this day, the treasure of the Wash has never been found, as though the earth itself conspired to erase his wealth. John was devastated. Chroniclers describe him as enraged, humiliated, and broken. But worse was yet to come. Shortly after the catastrophe, he stopped at Swineshead Abbey. There, perhaps in a desperate bid for comfort, he indulged in a reckless feast. Accounts differ, some say peaches and cider, others pears and ale. Whatever the details, the excess was fatal for a man already weakened by stress and exhaustion. That night, the illness began. Fever gripped him first, then cramps so severe they bent him double. Dysentery followed, violent, bloody, and merciless. His body, already strained by years of anxiety and restless travel, could no longer endure. John pressed on, carried in a litter by his men as they marched toward Newark Castle, one of the last strongholds still loyal to him. Every jolt of the cart brought agony. The once mighty king, who had ruled vast territories, now left behind a trail not of victories but of filth and misery. He was reduced to a husk of a man, writhing, helpless, and despised. By October 16, he reached Newark Castle. There, in its damp, torch-lit chambers, he collapsed. For 2 days, he lingered in torment. Between spasms of agony, he dictated his will, naming his 9-year-old son Henry as heir. He confessed sins, begged forgiveness, perhaps desperate to erase a lifetime of cruelty in his final hours. But forgiveness was unlikely to come. Those around him saw not a noble king dying but a tyrant receiving divine justice. On the night of October 18, 1216, John Lackland died. Chroniclers, many of whom loathed him, recorded his passing with grim satisfaction. They described him as consumed by torment, his body bursting with the poison he had carried within. Literal or metaphorical, the image was apartment. A man so full of greed, suspicion, and cruelty had finally been destroyed from the inside out. And yet, in the cruelest twist of fate, John's death saved his dynasty. The rebellion had been against the tyrant, not his child. His 9-year-old son, Henry, innocent of his father's sins, would inherit the throne. Into the void stepped William Marshal, England's greatest knight, who would guide the boy and reissue Magna Carta. But that belongs to the next chapter. For now, John's reign had ended in catastrophe. He had lost Normandy, lost the trust of his barons, lost the wealth he extorted, lost his dignity, and finally lost his life. In death, he left behind only a cautionary tale, a king who wanted everything but died with nothing. When the torches burned low inside Newark Castle on the night of October 18, 1216, a chapter of English history closed with a whisper, not a roar. John Lackland, once the King of England, Lord of Ireland, Duke of Normandy and Aquitaine, and Count of Anjou, was gone. His reign had been a parade of humiliation, lost wars, lost lands, lost wealth, and lost loyalty. He died in filth, ravaged by disease, abandoned by nearly all who once called him sovereign. Yet his passing, miserable as it was, triggered a transformation that saved the very kingdom he had nearly destroyed. The rebellion that had engulfed England was not against the Plantagenet dynasty itself, it was against John. His cruelty had united nobles, bishops, and even peasants in common cause, but with his death, the figure that embodied tyranny was removed. Into the vacuum stepped a boy, Henry, John's 9-year-old son. A child on the throne could easily have been a disaster. England had already invited Prince Louis of France to claim the crown. Louis's forces occupied London and much of the south. The barons who supported him believed they were on the verge of securing a foreign king who might bring stability where John had only sown chaos. But the moment John's death was announced, the calculation changed. Here was no tyrant. Here was a boy, innocent of his father's sins. A boy who could be shaped, guided, and molded by the very barons who had fought so bitterly against John. Supporting Louis might mean victory, but it also meant submitting to a French ruler, a foreigner who owed nothing to England's traditions. Rallying behind Henry, however, meant keeping the crown English, and it meant the chance to control a pliable young king. The man who made this vision possible was William Marshal, Earl of Pembroke, celebrated across Europe as one of the greatest knights of his age. Marshal had served John loyally, though often reluctantly, even when others abandoned him. Now, as regent for the boy king, he moved swiftly. He brought Henry to Gloucester Cathedral and arranged a hurried coronation. It was a spectacle unlike any before. No golden crown could be placed on Henry's head, the crown jewels lay at the bottom of the wash, swallowed by the tide. Instead, a simple circlet of gold from Queen Isabella's jewels was used. The symbolism mattered less than the image, a young, innocent king kneeling humbly in God's house, blessed by the church, surrounded not by hatred but by hope. The barons who had once rebelled hesitated. Could they truly justify fighting against a child crowned with the blessing of God and the guidance of William Marshal? Their anger had been against John, not Henry. Slowly, loyalties began to shift. Marshal understood that coronation alone would not be enough. He needed to heal the wounds John had inflicted. And so, in a masterstroke of statesmanship, he reissued Magna Carta. This time, however, the document was softened. The most radical clauses, those that might cripple royal authority, were removed. But its heart remained intact. The king was bound by law, taxation required consent, and no free man could be imprisoned without trial. By doing so, Marshal offered the barons everything they claimed to fight for, but without the hated figure of John to stand in the way. Suddenly, rebellion seemed unnecessary. Why serve a foreign prince when an English boy offered peace under a charter of liberties? The tide of war turned. Louis's forces, once welcomed as liberators, now appeared as occupiers. The legitimacy of his claim evaporated. Even those barons who had once supported him drifted away, preferring the safety of compromise to the uncertainty of conquest. Within a year, Louis's armies were defeated and forced back across the Channel. The rebellion dissolved. England was saved. The irony could not have been greater. John had spent his reign fighting to crush Magna Carta, insisting no king could be chained by law. Yet in death, it was Magna Carta that ensured his dynasty survived. His cruelty had birthed rebellion, his death allowed reconciliation. His tyranny had nearly destroyed the crown, his absence preserved it. To the chroniclers of the age, John's death was divine justice, a tyrant struck down by God. But history revealed a stranger truth: the tyrant's passing had given England a chance to rebuild. His son, Henry III, would reign for more than 50 years. And though his rule was turbulent, it rested on the foundation that John's failures had created, a monarchy constrained, however imperfectly, by law. As the years passed, Magna Carta was reaffirmed again and again. Each time a new king needed legitimacy, he turned to the charter, sealing it as a promise of justice. What began as a desperate peace forced upon John at Runnymede became a cornerstone of English tradition. Centuries later, its echoes would be heard across the world. English parliamentarians invoked it against kings who claimed absolute authority. American colonists cited it in their Declaration of Independence. Lawyers and reformers in every age pointed to it as proof that rulers, too, must answer to law. And all of it, the entire tradition of constitutional liberty, traced back to a tyrant's defeat, to the rebellion he provoked, and to the wretched death he endured in Newark Castle. It is one of history's strangest ironies. John Lackland, the king who lost everything, the villain immortalized in the legend of Robin Hood, left behind not glory, but a legacy greater than he could ever have imagined. He died unloved, unwept, and unhonored. But through his failures, he gave the world something it could never lose: the principle that no one, not even a king, is above the law. When the dust of rebellion settled and the banners of Prince Louis were carried back across the Channel, England entered a new chapter. Henry III's reign stretched on for more than half a century, marked by turbulence, reform, and renewal. Yet the roots of his legitimacy, the foundation of his throne, lay not in his own deeds but in the wreckage his father had left behind. John Lackland was dead, but his shadow remained. For centuries afterward, no English monarch dared name a son John. The name itself became taboo, a mark of disgrace unfit for royalty. Chroniclers, many of whom had loathed him personally, wrote of his paranoia, cruelty, and endless greed. They painted him not as a tragic figure but as a cautionary one, a king who betrayed his family, drained his people, defied his church, and destroyed his own dynasty's power. It is little wonder that legend quickly transformed him into the perfect villain. In the tales of Robin Hood, John appeared as the cowardly, conniving prince who schemed in his brother Richard's absence. He was the foil to the noble outlaw, the embodiment of tyranny and corruption. Popular memory did not soften with time, instead, it sharpened. To ordinary Englishmen, John was the king who bled them dry, who brought God's curse upon their land, who starved women and children in dungeons, who fled while enemies marched freely through their kingdom. Yet history is rarely so simple. For all his failures, John's reign left behind a legacy far greater than he ever intended. That legacy was Magna Carta. At the moment of its signing in 1215, it was little more than a desperate peace treaty, a laundry list of demands from angry barons. John never intended to honor it, and within weeks, he had it annulled. In the immediate years that followed, the document seemed fragile, perhaps even meaningless. But after John's death, William Marshal reissued it in Henry III's name. That act, more than any battle, saved the monarchy. By embracing Magna Carta, the Regency government turned rebellion into reconciliation. Over time, Magna Carta grew beyond its original context. It was reaffirmed and reissued repeatedly throughout the 13th century, each time taking deeper root in England's legal tradition. What began as baronial privilege evolved into a broader principle: the king was not above the law. By the 17th century, English parliamentarians invoked Magna Carta in their struggle against the Stuart kings, insisting that even monarchs must obey legal restraints. In the 18th century, American colonists pointed to it as their inheritance, declaring independence from another king they deemed tyrannical. Thomas Jefferson himself cited it as inspiration for the Declaration of Independence. In the 20th century, echoes of Magna Carta resonated again, shaping the Universal Declaration of Human Rights after 2 world wars. It is difficult to imagine a more profound irony. John, who hated the very idea of limits on his power, became the accidental father of constitutional law. His cruelty sparked resistance, his arrogance birthed rebellion, and his failures gave rise to principles that would echo across the globe. The king who wanted everything left behind nothing, but in the vacuum of his ruin, humanity gained one of its most enduring protections. Still, his personal reputation never recovered. Chroniclers described him as petty and vindictive, suspicious of everyone around him, consumed by jealousy of his brother Richard, and cursed with a nature that delighted in others' suffering. He lost Normandy, lost Anjou, lost the loyalty of his nobles, lost the trust of the church, and lost even the crown jewels of England to the tides of the Washington. He died in agony, reduced to a husk of a man, loathed by nearly all who knew him. 8 centuries later, historians still rank him among England's worst monarchs. Plays, novels, and films depict him as the greedy usurper, the cowardly prince, the very embodiment of bad kingship. His story is not one of redemption or greatness but of ruin. And yet, within that ruin lies the paradox that gives him lasting significance. John Lackland reminds us that history is not only shaped by heroes. Sometimes it is shaped by villains. Sometimes the very failures of a ruler carve out paths that no vision or nobility could have achieved. John tried to silence liberty, instead, he gave it a voice. He tried to crush resistance, instead, he forged its weapon. He tried to rule unchecked, instead, his downfall enshrined the principle that no ruler stands above the law. When we look back at John, we do not see the glory of a warrior king like his brother Richard, nor the brilliance of a statesman like his father Henry II. We see a cautionary tale. A man who wanted everything, clawed for it without restraint, and lost it all. A king who died despised, his body broken by disease, his reputation buried under centuries of scorn. And yet, out of his reign came something extraordinary, a legacy he never chose, never wanted, and would never have celebrated. Magna Carta was his defeat, but it was also his gift to history. A gift born of tyranny, rebellion, and failure, but one that endured far beyond the man who tried to destroy it. In the end, John Lackland, the landless prince who rose to be king, left behind an empire in ashes but a principle that became immortal. His empire vanished, his treasures sank, his name rotted in legend. But the idea that rulers must be bound by law survived, crossing oceans, shaping nations, and inspiring generations. And so history remembers him not with honor but with irony. For the worst of kings left the best of legacies.